Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's meeting to discuss the status and conservation of the Connecticut Warbler. Hopefully you're in the right spot. My name is Ryan Brady, and I'm an avian conservation biologist for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. I'm based near Ashland in northern Wisconsin on the south shore of Lake Superior. I also serve as the interim coordinator of the entity that's hosting today's meeting. That's the Northern Forest Bird Network. The network is a partnership of government and non-government organizations across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan that helps to guide monitoring, research, and management actions for thriving northern forest bird communities across the U.S. portion of Bird Conservation Region 12. We operate under the Upper Miss Great Lakes joint venture umbrella, and one of our priority species is the Connecticut Warbler. But that's not exactly the reason we're here today. The immediate motivation for this stems from some recent surveys that we've completed here in Wisconsin and the precipitous declines in Connecticut warblers that we're experiencing here in our state, as well as other U.S. states here at the southern edge of its breeding range. I'll get more into those details later, but as we were thinking about kind of how to deal with these declines, actions to take, kind of where to go with all this, it became pretty clear that we needed range-wide input and collaboration. And so that sparked the idea of getting us all in the same room together. So that's why we're all here today. Thank you for taking the time to make it. I never would have imagined we would have had 23 participants that could come together today to talk about Connecticut warblers. So thanks so much. The overarching goals for today are really kind of twofold. One is information sharing, and then the other is some preliminary conservation planning, some brainstorming and discussion. So, how widespread are these declines? What's causing them? What can we do about it? What are some of the information gaps that we really need to fill? And frankly, for us here south of the border, do you guys in Canada have the same urgency and concern that we do here at the edge of the range? Because things are happening quickly and not in a good way down here. So to tackle all this, we've got a pretty long day scheduled, about 6 hours here, 9 to 3 Central Time. And I know that's kind of a long day. We only have one break built in for lunch midday. So come and go as you need to. I know you'll probably be popping in and out. That's kind of an expectation. That's just fine. This morning, we're going to focus on geographic updates from the states and provinces, as well as find out what's going on in the wintering grounds in South America. And then this afternoon is going to be more brainstorming discussion related to research and monitoring and threats and what conservation actions we need to take, and some of them pressing. And then we'll conclude with kind of how we move forward. What are the next steps? How do we keep this effort rolling? Some logistics. The session's being recorded, as you heard, and we do plan on putting those up online, probably in smaller chunks, not one big chunk of the whole meeting. So we hope to do that if all goes well, fingers crossed. We also have someone taking notes for us and capturing main points. And so we will hopefully consolidate those into some sort of small document that summarizes the meeting at some point later also. Reminder to keep yourself muted when you're not speaking, though we definitely want to keep this kind of informal. So if you want to unmute and speak up, by all means, go right ahead. If you're more comfortable with the chat, you can use that. I'll do my best to monitor, as will the other folks, although admittedly, it's not one of my great skills to pay really great attention to the chat. So if I miss something, someone alert me of what's going on. And for those of you who will be presenting at some point, you will be sharing your screen. Everyone has permission to do so. So you're going to do a screen share. So be prepared for that, and then you'll stop sharing your screen when you're done, and we'll move on to the next person. So I think I've covered the background and basics. Does anybody have any questions on how things are going to work or comments? All right, fantastic. So we are going to move on to some introductions then. And we don't have time, like I said, for real detailed things. I'd love to all of us just chat and get to know each other, but we just have too many people for that. But at the same time, I wanted to make sure we all kind of had a chance to let people know who we were in at least a basic way. So again, when I will call on you to speak and unmute yourself and give your name, who you work for, or your affiliation, your position, especially as it relates to birds or Connecticut warblers, and then the region that you're representing. So we kind of know the geography that you're coming from. So for example, Ryan Brady, conservation biologist, Wisconsin DNR, coming to you from Northern Wisconsin. You know, something like that, and then we'll head on to the next person. And we need each of these to only take about 30, 45 seconds to kind of get through everybody and stay on the schedule. So try and keep to that if you can, please. And so I'm going to start with my co-host, Alexis. And Alexis is not only co-hosting, she's running all the technology today. So thanks a lot for doing that. Alexis, take it away.
Hello, everybody. My name is Alexis Grinde, and I am an avian ecologist and run the Avian Ecology Lab that is at the Natural Resources Research Institute at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. And we work in Minnesota. Thank you all for coming.
Annie, why don't you go ahead and next.
Thank you. My name is Annie Bracey, and I work in Alexis's lab as well at NRI. I mainly work with water birds, wetland birds, so I will just be taking notes today.
All right, Steve.
Morning, everybody. My name is Steve Colby. I also work in Alexis Grinde's lab here in northern Minnesota, and I've led a field crew for a couple past seasons doing nest searching, monitoring, and post-fledging dispersal work with Connecticut warblers.
All right, Craig from Wisconsin.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Craig Thompson. I am a colleague of Ryan's in the Natural Heritage Conservation Program, and I coordinate the department's international migratory bird conservation efforts.
All right, thank you. Jacques.
Hi, so my name is Jacques Barzabal. I'm a professor at the University of Quebec at Chicoutimi, where I am a professor in terrestrial wildlife and director of the fundamental science program. I have been interested in different aspects of research on the Connecticut warbler since 2007, mainly in Quebec.
Thank you very much. Andy, Minnesota.
Good morning. My name's Andy Forbes. I am coming from the Twin Cities in Minnesota. I am currently acting assistant regional director for the migratory bird program in the Midwest region for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It's a 8-state region, which includes Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan from a Connecticut warbler standpoint. I am also on the management board for the Upper Mississippi Great Lakes joint venture, which Ryan referenced before. Really excited to hear what folks have to say here. As Ryan said, this is a priority species for us. So looking forward to learning and listening and finding out how we can help. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Andy. Brianne from Michigan.
Morning, everyone. I am Brianne Boan. I am a wildlife biologist on the north zone of the Ottawa National Forest.
All right, thank you. Dave. Dave out there? There we go.
Yes, hello. Yeah, my name is Dave Isles. I'm an analyst with Canadian Wildlife Service here in Ottawa.
Okay, thank you. Bruno.
Hello, I'm Bruno Drolet from Quebec City. I'm a senior biologist working with land bird, forest land bird conservation and management. And I worked on Connecticut Warbler in the past. And so I'm very happy to be here because we share the same concern for Connecticut Warbler conservation here in Quebec. than you just alluded to minutes ago. Thanks.
Thank you. Erin, Alberta.
Hello, I'm Erin Bayne. I'm a professor at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, and I am a director of something called the ABMI Wild Tracks, which is kind of a data management system, as well as I'm a member of the steering committee of the Boreal Avian Modeling Project, which has integrated a ton of the data that's probably available for the species.
Okay, thank you. Josh, Minnesota.
Hi, I'm Josh Bedner. I work in Alexis Grinde's lab here in Minnesota at the NRI. Did my master's work in black spruce and tamarack on breeding birds here in Minnesota, so representing northern Minnesota.
Okay, thank you. Judith, Michigan. Not Michigan, Judith, Alberta.
Boreal ecologist on Canadian Wildlife Service. Actually, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba is the region that I'm supposed to jointly cover with Steve Van Wilgenburg, who hasn't shown up quite yet.
Okay, thank you. Junior.
Hello all, Junior Tremblay, research scientist at Environment Climate Change Canada. I'm leading a research program on boreal birds and ecosystems, and I'm also member of the Boreal Avian modeling team that Erin was referring to, and I'm based in Quebec City.
All right, Kevin Fraser.
Hi folks, I'm associate professor in biological sciences at the University of Manitoba. We're only about an hour away from Connecticut Warbler breeding habitat here. I helped out on a migration ecology project that we'll talk about in a little bit.
All right, thank you. Kevin Hanna.
Hi, everybody. Kevin Hanna. I'm with the Canadian Wildlife Service based in Ottawa. I represent the Ontario region. I guess I've been sort of captivated by the species since I saw my first one in the early 90s in Alberta, and done a little bit of work on some of the vocal behavior of the species and geographic patterns of its song. But obviously would like to do some more work on its breeding ecology and habitat use. So looking forward to today's session. Thanks.
Thank you. Is it Marcel?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Marcel Gahbauer. I'm a biologist with the Canadian Wildlife Service, based at the National Wildlife Research Centre in Ottawa. I'm also co-chair of the Bird Subcommittee of COSEWIC, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, where we've been thinking about this species for the past few years. And in both roles, I have basically a national focus.
Okay, thank you. Mark from British Columbia.
Morning, everybody. I'm Mark Phinney, habitat biologist with Canadian Forest Products, or CAN4. Live and work right in the heart of the northwestern part of Connecticut Warbler breeding range. I've been interested in this species for a couple of decades now, and have been, concerned about its status here as well.
All right, thank you. Mary Beth from Michigan.
Good morning. I am the wildlife technician for the Ottawa National Forest in Michigan, and I assist Brianne with habitat planning projects. And I've only ever seen a Connecticut warbler once, and it was during migration.
All right. Thank you. Michael Paling.
Hey, everybody. Michael Paling. I am a forester with American Bird Conservancy based out of Marquette, Michigan.
All right, thank you. Mike Burrell.
Yeah, hi, everybody. Mike Burrell here in Peterborough, Central Ontario. I work for the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry as the provincial zoologist for vertebrates at our CDC, which we call the Natural Heritage Information Center.
All right, thank you. Mike Hallworth.
Hi, everyone. I'm a conservation ecologist and data scientist at the nonprofit in Vermont Center for Eco Studies. And I think I'm representing maybe range-wide Connecticut warbler here, and I did a postdoc on kind of migratory connectivity of Connecticut warblers.
All right, thanks, Mike. Nick, Wisconsin.
Hey, I'm Nick Anich with the Wisconsin DNR. I work out of the same office as Ryan up in Ashland on Lake Superior. I am the coordinator for the Wisconsin Breeding Bird Atlas, the second atlas, which is one of the things that led us to realize the species is doing so poorly locally.
Okay, did I miss anyone?
Yes, Tim Poole. I'm a species at risk biologist for the government of Manitoba, and I'm based in Winnipeg and representing Manitoba.
Thanks, Tim. Sorry, I had you down and your name bumped up on my participant list. You must have set some sort of higher priority on my list. So you're really important.
Sorry, Ryan, have you heard from Adam Smith?
Adam Smith is going to be joining us later, not too much later. He intends to be here. And I think Steve Van Wilgenburg from Saskatchewan was intending to come later as well.
Okay, thanks.
Those are, I think, the only other two that I heard from with intentions of coming. There were a few others with interest who could not make it. Andrew Coughlin, Christian Artuso, Christian, is it Fries? Overall, engaged with a lot of the folks who had interest, I think. And I mean, yeah, fantastic to have 24 people on here, and we'll have a few more joining us as we go along. Okay, last call. I didn't miss anyone else, right? Okay, well, thank you for keeping your introductions on point there. We even got a little bit ahead of time, which is fantastic. And again, I'm just absolutely extremely grateful, to have you all here and to see this much energy for the species. So with that said, let's get going. Unfortunately, you get to hear me more first. So I'm going to start with giving a brief intro to the bird and what's going on here in the US. And then we're slide right from that into the state updates. And I've got Wisconsin on there first. So I'll just kind of keep rolling into the Wisconsin update from there. And then we will spread to the others. And just a reminder, yeah, we've got a few minutes to spare here on the agenda, but generally we need to keep these on point. So if you are speaking after 10 minutes or so, I will start making noise and remind you that we need to keep things going, because when you have a series of talks, as you know, if you get off a bit, it really cascades through the day and will keep us here a long time. And depending on the length of the presentation, there may be time for questions, one or two at the end within the 10-minute slot. Otherwise, you could put your questions into the chat. And then when someone's done their presentation, they could go back and address those. We'll also save the chat at the end, and we can make sure we capture those and address them. All right. So with that said, I'm going to get my presentation going here. I'm going to share my screen. And let me know when you can see a presentation there.
You're good, Ryan.
Good. Okay. That's great. All right. So I'm going to start with the overview for the US. And I thought it would be good to start right at the outset with just kind of a basic introduction to the bird, because even though most of us know the bird quite well, there might be others who don't, and there might be others who watch this later who don't. So this is an uncommon species to begin with, and it is rather narrowly distributed in terms of its breeding range, shown here on the map in the pink or the red, that narrow swath across mostly the boreal forest of Canada. Then the yellow here is depicting migration, which is a much narrower depiction of reality probably. And then the blue is a generalized wintering area. At last estimate from Partners in Flight, PIF, which you might hear about later, they put a ballpark of 1.8 million birds range wide. Obviously, that comes with some grains of salt, which we'll talk about because the numbers going into that estimate. But that's about what we're dealing with. About 97%, again, numbers today are going to be all with grains of salt because so little is known about this bird. So we have to kind of just get into the range for these. But about 97, i.e. most, of the Connecticut warblers during breeding season are found in Canada. Within their range, they occupy a wide variety of habitat types. And I think we'll hear about that today. And that's one of the reasons for the regional updates is to hear about the habitats they're using in these different states. But I think the common theme for many of those is going to be structure. So they may be different cover types, but they lead to a similar habitat structure, pole-sized trees, widely spaced, open mid-canopy, well-developed ground layer, things like that. And it's that range as well as the habitats it occupies that often make the bird difficult to find. They're hard to reach in many cases, somewhat remote, difficult to access habitats, but then even so, their behavior is very much known as being secretive, kind of a skulker, especially in migration, probably in winter, and certainly for females and the young. Exceptions might be those singing males, right? They're loud, they call very persistently. You don't always see them. They're pretty good at hiding when they're singing, but occasionally they're open in a perch. But the point is they're generally difficult to detect outside of those singing males during breeding season. They winter in South America, and we'll hear about that later. In spring, when they return north, they're one of our latest migrants, reaching the northern portions of the US in the latter third of May, and especially the last week of May, and then leaking into the Canadian breeding grounds during the end of May and early June. In the fall, they're known for, in some cases at least, some long transoceanic flights off the eastern seaboard of North America, down into the Caribbean and into northern South America. In some cases, 2 or 3 days nonstop. So they something to remember as we're thinking about a kind of full life cycle conservation of the species. And then lastly, and importantly, they are poorly understood. They're one of the least well-known songbirds or least known songbirds, and especially warblers that we have in North America. And so there's a lot of things we don't know, and that's one of the reasons we're in the predicament we're in, I think. All right, so honing in on the US, again, here's a zoom in on the breeding range. You can see that pink breeding range really only extends into northern portions of Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, and northern or the upper peninsula of Michigan. So those are the only 3 states that have a breeding population of these species in the US. And if we hone in a little, excuse me, before we move in a little closer, I just wanted to throw out the reminder that this represents, at least for the US portion, the western part of bird conservation region 12, shown in the blue here. So if we hone in a little bit and use, look at relative abundance. So this is one of the eBird status and trends products. Again, not perfect, not the most ideal model, but it is, I think, pretty good at telling the general story. So in this depiction, the breeding season are the reds, green is spring migration, yellow is fall migration, and then the gray is where the bird is not really modeled in any significant abundance. And so what you can see from this is that the bird is very low relative abundance in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, very low now in Wisconsin as well, and better, albeit not great, in northern Minnesota, and especially so in north central Minnesota, which I'm sure Alexis will talk about, which has relatively decent numbers and certainly the best numbers that remain in the US portion of their breeding range. I'm not going to talk much about the breeding bird survey. Adam's going to cover kind of overarching declines from the BBS. The BBS once did a half decent job in the US at giving some stats. And so you can see the general declining trend since the late 60s when the survey began, but probably somewhere in the 90s and certainly by early 2000s, the BBS was no longer effective here in most of the US. Minnesota, maybe still partially so, but certainly in Michigan and Wisconsin, by the turn of the century, the numbers were so low that the breeding bird survey really is not a great tool for monitoring. So I would argue declines here are in the US are over 60% without question, even though that's about where the latest number I could find was. And then in terms of conservation status, there is no special status for this bird at the national level, nor has there ever been in the US. If we look to the Partners in Flight Land Bird Conservation Plan, which was last revised in 2016, and that is for both Canada and the continental US. It was listed as a D yellow watch list species, D meaning declining populations. And so that comes from a pretty steep decline shown in that red bar on the bar graph under PT for population trend. Moderate to high threats to that population shown in the orange, as well as a moderate population size. But then somewhat lower vulnerability scores for its range because it doesn't have a very small range and it's also migratory and things like that. So that could change obviously, but the point being is it is of high conservation concern, and many of the species that made that yellow watch list had declines of 50 to 90% of their population in just 40 years. And so that's exactly what we're talking about with this species. The last PIF, Partners in Flight estimate that I could find for all of the US was about 50,000 individuals. Again, it's based a lot on BBS data, some other sources of data. That is a very general number. At best, though, it lets you know we're probably dealing with tens of thousands of birds, with chances that it's even less than that, or maybe in some cases, at least in recent years, it may even have been a little higher than that. And then I should also point out, it has made some other priority lists like the joint venture that Andy mentioned and our Northern Forest Bird Network. And also there was a recent process to identify regional species of greatest conservation need, and it was added to the Midwest Regional Species of Conservation Need list. So with that, that's my US update. Does anybody have any questions about anything I presented there on the US overview? And someone can let me know if there's anything in the chat, that'd be great.
There's nothing in the chat.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, then we will move on to the state updates. And we're going to start with Wisconsin. And I think our goal with these state updates is to just get to know the bird in the different states and provinces. There's new similarities certainly across all of them, but no doubt there's going to be nuances. And many of us don't know exactly the status of the bird, the trends, the habitat use, the range of the bird, all those sorts of things within these different regions. And so this is a way for us to kind of get up to speed on what we are all dealing with. So for the Wisconsin story, I'm going to start it a couple decades ago, back in the mid-1990s when we started our first breeding bird atlas project. And that was conducted from 1995 to 2000. And these were the results from that effort. And the blocks or squares that you see are colored if a Connecticut warbler was found, at least one, within that block as potentially breeding during the breeding season. And what you can see from the Wisconsin perspective is that it's largely a bird of the north, the northern tier, the north woods, at one time from east to west, kind of across our northern part of our state. There is also a small kind of disjunct population down in the central portion of the state in an area of very dry sandy soils where the birds use jack pine habitat. And I've circled 3 kind of core areas here and kind of just take a mental picture of, excuse me, what you see in there and the blocks that are occupied. And within all of these areas in Wisconsin, these birds are using 3 different habitats, or at least they were at the time of the first breeding bird atlas. The first was this one that I think most people think of Connecticut warblers as occupying, these black spruce and tamarack lowlands. Again, somewhat full-sized, generally free of mid-level shrubs, yet good ground cover, mosses, and so forth. We have quite a bit of a population that occurs in our sandy, piney habitats. Primarily the birds in those habitats are using jack pine. So believe it or not, this is a photo of a older jack pine stand that's on very dry soil. And I think it's striking if you look at the structure of those 2 different cover types, and they look awfully similar. And you have widely spaced trees, some variable kind of stocking density to those. You don't have much for deciduous shrubs. You have a good layer of blueberry and other ground level vegetation, some mosses and things like that. So that's very consistent across these 2 types. And then back when the first atlas was conducted, they were also using habitat on the fringes of these, what I call kind of more generic Northwoods habitat that we have. For example, kind of a mixed aspen fir forest. And again, structurally similar, pole-sized trees and so forth. That habitat use is long gone now, but it was something that they used at one time, and I think we'll hear that they're still using in some other parts of it. And within these areas, back in the 90s, we had anecdotal reports of folks going out in the morning and finding dozens of singing Connecticut warblers. And I think I recall one birder found 60-some singing males on a few-hour transect on a June morning, especially in that jack pine habitat. So that is kind of what we were dealing with not that long ago. Fast forward 20 years, 2015 to 2019, we completed our second breeding bird atlas. And these are preliminary results. We're still working these up into finalization and publication. But you can see the number of blocks and squares occupied is much declined over that time, much fewer. If we circle those 3 core areas again, still a couple birds hanging on in that disjunct part of the south. Great declines in that northeast portion of the range bordering the upper peninsula of Michigan. And then the remaining stronghold is in the northwest corner where during the second atlas, some birds were using the black spruce tamarack bogs, and then many were using the jack pine stands on sandy soils. So this is a change map from the 2 atlases. So what you're looking at are fair comparison blocks. These are blocks that had adequate coverage that allowed for fair comparison across both atlases. The yellow indicates blocks where the species was found as possibly breeding in the first atlas. And you can see there are 36 of those yellow ones. The blue represents where the bird was only found during the second atlas, and there are only 4 of those. And then the gray represents the blocks where it was found in both, and there are only 3 of those. So overall, in terms of the number of fair comparison blocks occupied, there was a 70% decline across the 2 atlases 20 years apart. So that was obviously alarming and something that we wanted to try to investigate further and get a hold of. So we had a sense declines were occurring rather rapidly. And so what we did was we went right back out a couple of years later and revisited some historical sites within those 3 core areas, as well as some high quality habitat types. So selecting black spruce, tamarack, older jack pine stands, and so forth. And we went out there and did a series of point counts during the breeding season, trying to detect singing males. And so you can see all the markings for the different types of habitats that we surveyed. The red asterisk here, that was a known breeding location. We did not survey that in 2021. We knew there were some birds there. We were more interested in seeing, did we have any birds anywhere else? And unfortunately, the answer was no, we didn't. We found 0 Connecticut warblers anywhere away from that red asterisk, despite 428 point counts at 58 sites. That doesn't mean they're never there. It doesn't mean we couldn't have missed some. It doesn't mean they're not in someplace else, but we felt those were the best of the best, and we didn't find any, which was extremely alarming. So here is a look at kind of the retreat of the species range. And in this particular graphic, the green blocks, the dark green and the lighter green, represent kind of old records. So this is the last time the Connecticut warbler was detected in these blocks. And in the case of the green, it was no more recent than the first atlas of the late 1990s. In the yellow, that represents early 2000s records that we still had. That was the last time they were detected there. Orange represents the second atlas, so you can see there are fewer of the orange blocks than the green blocks, and they are much more restricted in range. And then the red represents the only sites we know of breeding season birds during the years 2020 and 2021. And as you can see, it's only 2 blocks, and in fact, it was one small area kind of adjacent to each other. So in 2022, just this past summer, we went to that last known site within those red blocks with the goal of determining how many birds we were dealing with, how many were out there. Was it dozens? Was it hundreds? Was it a few? And we conducted surveys all around the area and came up with only 3 singing males, which was even fewer than we had found casually and incidentally the year before. And so that was the bad news. The good news was we had a technician out there, and he did determine that the birds were paired with females, and they all successfully raised some young. So we did have positive reproductive success for the few birds that were found. And this is a photo of the actual site where those birds nested, an older jack pine stand with very nice blueberry at the ground level. So as for its conservation status here, it is an S2 ranking as a breeding species in the state ranking system. Lower numbers are bad, higher numbers are good in terms of how widespread a bird is. So it was an S2 at the last revision. It was also a species of greatest conservation need, and it was listed as a species of special concern in Wisconsin. Obviously, we are about to undergo a revision of the wildlife action plans, and there's a good chance that that status will be elevated to something a bit more urgent. We will see. And I just wanted to throw out there that the partners in flight estimate was about 3,200, again, based on BBS data going in, so not very accurate. It had very wide confidence intervals, as low as 600 up to 7,000. I think even 600 is very generous. We may have dozens of Connecticut warblers in Wisconsin. We may only have a few handfuls. I don't think we have hundreds that are breeding anymore. So what are we doing about it? And this is my last slide. A lot of this is unfolded in the last year or two, but we immediately have looked to habitat management work. That last remaining site with birds is actually private land. And so we've worked with the private landowner to ensure the perpetuation of that site and the habitat. We also have partnered with adjacent landowners such as the Bayfield County Forest and working with them to protect any remaining habitat, improve existing habitat. For example, we have a pilot project that's going to remove brush from deciduous brush like hazel and oak that's in the understory to open up some otherwise suitable stands. And we want to see if that sort of treatment can work to make it favorable for Connecticut warblers. And then coming up with some long-term planning for habitat too, ensuring that there are stands of habitat in the long run. Importantly, our habitat work so far has focused on the jack pine habitat type. We have not done any action in the black spruce tamarack sites quite yet. We're also raising public awareness through media and presentations. Craig, for example, was just on our state public radio station this morning talking about Connecticut warblers. So raising the red flag and then obviously getting professionals together in meetings like this to make sure everyone's aware of what's going on here and how they can help. And then lastly, fundraising. We have a great Wisconsin birdathon. We have made this species a beneficiary of the proceeds of that birdathon. So there will be some work that helps benefit the conservation of Connecticut warbler through there. And we've also increased our investment in the Neotropical Flyways project, which deals more with stopover habitat related to Connecticut warblers, but is a good start. And if we ever kind of get a similar project that hones in on Connecticut warbler wintering ground habitat, then we will certainly invest in that as well. So with that, that's my Wisconsin update. I've got time for maybe a question. If anybody has any.
Ryan, it's Mark Phinney here.
Hi, Mark.
Your jack pine stands, are they natural as in fire origin, or does the bird ever inhabit plantations?
Both. The remaining ones are natural, and I do believe those are favored. But we do have some occurrences that have been in plantations, and we're hoping moving forward that could be a solution, especially because where these birds are living, we have a small population of Kirtland's warblers. And we're maybe looking at kind of how we could design stands to serve the needs of Kirtland's warbler in their younger years, and then what it might take to transition those to Connecticut warbler habitat in the older years of the stands.
Thanks.
Hi, this is Mary Beth. Can I ask a quick question?
You may.
How old were those jack pine stands?
A lot of them are, I think we were ballparking at like 40 to 60 years old. But we've seen birds use younger stands too, down to where, tree height is only 25 feet, and it's even more open than what you see in some of the pictures that I showed. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. We can certainly raise some additional questions and topics later when we get into the more discussionary period as well, but those are good questions to start. Thanks for that. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I do believe that next up will be Minnesota, and Alexis will be presenting there.
Thank you, Ryan. You guys can see my screen okay?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. I lose all the power when I share. Okay. Thank you, Ryan. Again, thank you all for joining us. It is remarkable. I think when Ryan and I started talking about having this meeting, we thought maybe 5 people would show up. So I'm very happy to be having this conversation with all of you. The story of Connecticut's and Minnesota is very similar to that to what's going on in Wisconsin that Ryan just shared. I have been leading this lab for about 6 years now, but I also inherited a long-term data set from Jerry Nemi, who I'm sure most of you know in some regard. And so we have a lot of long-term data on the status of Connecticut's in the state. And you know, I'll share some of that information with you, but it's all just bad news, really. So as Ryan showed with the eBird map, there is sort of this really sweet spot in Minnesota for the distribution of Connecticut warblers, and it's up in the north central part of the state in an area called the Red Lake Peatlands, or the Agassiz subsection. And that is really where we have a lot of our remaining Connecticut warblers. There's another sort of hotspot in the Saxon Bog area, which is in the sort of northeastern part of the state, for those of you that are familiar with Minnesota. That Saxon Bog area, the southern part, is more fragmented and has a lot of like agricultural roads sort of going through it, whereas the Red Lake Peatlands in the northern part of the state, where they are, is just as remote as we really get here in Minnesota. And that's where I think their stronghold still is, and that's where we've been focusing a lot of our research and attention and habitat management as well. So what do we know about the Connecticut warbler population trends? Like I said, it's not great news. The BBS, similar to what Ryan mentioned, you know, has been showing declines, but I don't think that it's being well monitored with the BBS at all. We in our lab have a long-term monitoring program that was established in the early 90s by Jerry Nemi, and it focuses on systematic habitat-specific surveys in two of Minnesota's national forests, Chippewa National Forest and Superior National Forest. And so that's where we really got a lot of information about the trends, because we're going to really, it's black spruce stands that have been part of this long-term monitoring program. And so we have good data. And when I started in the lab, it was about 2010. And we were doing our first Minnesota breeding bird atlas survey. And so that's the map in the middle here that you're looking at from the BBA. And, you know, we had a lot of observations throughout where these boxes are, which represent the general location of the national forest. But since that time, or, you know, even during that time in the mid 2000s, we were seeing declining population trends. But, you know, since that time, we've really gotten down and barely see them at all. I think about 4 years ago, we had our first year where we didn't observe any Connecticut warblers, which is a huge change from the mid 90s when we first started this, when we'd see, you know, document anywhere from 20 to 50 any given season. And so we've got 2 or 3 kind of popping in Chippewa and Superior National Forest every year observations, but certainly we see that they're, or we feel that they're range is sort of retracting and headed north. We don't see them as much in the southern part of the state anymore. They used to be observed sort of in the mid area of the state. I doubt if we went back, we would see them at all there anymore. And we were sort of thinking about doing something similar to what Wisconsin did, is revisiting some of these blocks where they were documented during our first round of Atlas, just to sort of make sure that they're not there. And I'm pretty sure they're just not. So it's very concerning. We've been talking about it for a long time in our lab. And again, this is one of the outcomes that we've been hoping for, that other people would be interested in their conservation as well. In Minnesota, they're pretty much exclusively found in black spruce tamarack lowlands, and we see the highest densities currently in a lot of our tamarack stands. For all of the forest birds that we study here, it's our biggest habitat specialist. It's almost never observed anywhere else, any sort of periphery habitats, even like it is in Wisconsin. And really specifically, it's got its highest densities in these really large blocks of forested habitat, but specifically lowland conifer habitat. And similar to what Ryan was saying, it's that stand structure that seems to be key. You know, we don't see it in the dense black spruce forests, and it's really sort of this pole-sized timber or black spruce. Right now in Minnesota, we have a lot of eastern large beetle infestation that's sort of creating some down trees in a lot of the tamarack stands, and they're really liking that structure, opening up the canopy. But the mossy understory with a little bit of like blueberry or shrubbery is really where we see them most often. In terms of conservation status, it is designated as a species in greatest conservation need by the Minnesota DNR, and they list the reasons as habitat loss, fragmentation, and degradation. But really, it hasn't been studied except for as part of like our larger monitoring programs or the breeding bird surveys. It is a sensitive species in both of the national forests, and so they are sort of aware of some of the habitat recommendations that we've been making with regards to looking at fragmentation and not cutting these big tracts of lowland conifer around where they've been breeding. Ryan's already mentioned the joint ventures and the partners in flight status here. Because of some of the things that we've been seeing with the trends of Connecticut warblers, in 2019, we started a study to figure out more of their breeding ecology. And so the study lasted for 2 years. In 2019, we focused our efforts down in the Saxon Bog area, which is B here on the slide. And then in 2020, we went up to the Red Lake peatlands and focused our study area up there. Basically, what we were doing is mapping male territories and then looking for nests and females, and then documenting nest success and tagging juveniles. And Steve Colby, who's on the meeting, led that field effort. I'm sure he'll talk about it a lot more this afternoon when we have more time. But essentially what you're looking at here in this first graphic is all of the white dots are singing males that were on territory. The yellow stars are the nests that we found. We found a total of 11 nests, and that might seem like a very small number, but for those of you that have tried to study Connecticut warblers, it's an enormous number. And we really learned a lot about the substrates they're using, you know, just their nesting ecology in general. Once we monitored the nests, we tried to, well, we did put transmitters on the juveniles once they were ready, and we tracked them. We learned a lot about that too, which we can talk about later this afternoon, but essentially the juveniles don't disperse very far, like a lot of other forest bird species do. You know, within the first week, they only move maybe a maximum of 55 meters from the nest. And basically they just sort of scurry around on the forest floor. It made the transmitters and the attachments sort of tricky because they would get caught on vegetation, and there were some issues, of course, with that, but we did learn a lot. And essentially the take-home point of that study is that the reason that they need these large tracts of forest likely is because they don't leave from them. The male comes, they nest there, and the juveniles likely stay in that same forest stand until they're more proficient flyers and getting ready to prepare for migration. So that's huge and really important, I think, to emphasize the importance of that fragmentation piece that we're seeing here in a lot of the areas that they used to use. Another sort of piece that we've been trying to get in place here in Minnesota is a changing habitat management. So as I mentioned, they're found in our highest densities in tamarack stands from what we know, but previously they used to be in black spruce stands. We just don't see them as at high densities anymore. And in Minnesota, black spruce stands are even age management, so they're cut and then seeded, and then they all grow, and it doesn't have the structure I think that they need. And so we've been trying to work with the DNR and county foresters to sort of see if we can get them to change some of their forest management practices and do alternative things like gap cuts or strip cutting in these black spruce to see if we can make more habitat that's usable while, you know, doing all the things that foresters do to get the timber off the ground. And so that's been a ongoing thing, and we have a couple of experimental sites that we're monitoring. But yeah, happy to talk more about that later. Go ahead and stop sharing.
I think we have time for a question if anybody has any.
I have a quick question.
Go ahead.
Thanks for that, Alexis. You mentioned the juveniles, the track juveniles didn't move very far for the first week or so. I think you said close to the nest. Do you know when the adults and juveniles eventually left that very local patch? Were you able to track them that long?
Steve, do you know that off the top of your head?
Yeah, the small number that we were able to track for longer, they stayed within 100 or 200 meters of the nest for at least 3 weeks. So
wow,
quite a long time, especially compared to some of the other, we are doing sort of like parallel studies with other species, and it's nothing like that. So yeah, it seemed like they were hugging very tight to those core areas.
Great, thanks.
One other quick one, or anyone? Okay, thanks, Alexis. So next up is going to be Brianne giving us an update from Michigan, which is going to be even more sobering.
Unfortunately, I do not have a wonderful PowerPoint slideshow to show you all, so that will begin our sobering update.
No problem.
So I think, Ryan, you pretty much covered a great map that included the UP of the distribution of the Connecticut Warbler, basically within Michigan. So the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, also known as the UP, is near the southern edge of the Connecticut Warbler's breeding range. Previous publications have reported wide distribution across the Upper Peninsula, occurring in almost every county, but those occurrences really tended to be patchy and very localized. Breeding bird counts were conducted on the Ottawa National Forest, so most of my data I have in my experiences from the Ottawa National Forest, so it's going to be even more localized, and a little bit of the surrounding area as well. So our breeding bird counts were conducted in Ottawa from 1991 to 2010. And within that time frame, the last recorded detection during those counts was in 2005. Talking to some local prominent birders, it's highly suspected that the Connecticut Warbler may be extirpated from the breeding grounds in the Western Upper Peninsula. However, looking at eBird sightings, data does show some sporadic sightings throughout all of Michigan between 2017 and 2020, but this also includes migration sightings as well. So on the Ottawa National Forest, we primarily focus on habitat surveys, and we do keep an optimistic ear out for singing males during these and other surveys that we conduct. And we've been very, very fortunate to be blessed with very strong birders as technicians. So that's been awesome. The habitat that, when sightings did occur, the habitat that was reported was very interesting. It varied from deciduous to coniferous, deciduous being lowland deciduous areas, and often included white pine, lowland red maple, lowland aspen areas, and balsam fir. The most consistent factor in those stands, though, was a very high ground cover component, and several of the sites were at the edges of wetlands or stands that were right adjacent to wetlands. So our current habitat surveys, we do focus on the lowland conifer sites. However, we do include some lowland hardwood swamp sites as well. So let's see here, conservation status in Michigan. We don't have any legal status in Michigan. It's not considered threatened or endangered. It is rated as an S3 species. It is a bird of conservation concern for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It is on that list. On the Ottawa National Forest, it is considered a regional forest sensitive species of concern. It's also, or RFSS, it's also an RFSS for the Hiawatha National Forest, the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest, the Chippewa, and the Superior National Forest. So all of those forests are focused on managing for the Connecticut Warbler. Population trend, like everyone else, declining. Let's see, so recent news or projects of interest. So I came on the Ottawa in 2020, and I noticed that our black spruce stands and black spruce components are dying out with very little regeneration. And being that the Connecticut Warbler, one of our RFSS species, among other species that we have that really benefits from black spruce, I have begun pursuing habitat improvement and really just diving into habitat improvement for especially a black spruce component. So hopefully I'm making some headway on that. We haven't begun any projects yet, but I have incorporated that in a recent large vegetation management project. Just gonna try out one site. So hopefully that happens in the near future. I also work on improving jackpine habitat for Kirtland Warbler, which is also going to be signed very soon. And Kirtland Warbler specialize in jackpine habitat, but younger jackpine habitat. And so the exciting thing with this is that I am managing very large blocks of land from 300 to 550 acres for Kirtland Warbler habitat that is primarily focused on jackpine region. And the idea is to get these habitats into a rotation that they will reach full maturation so they can be harvested. And that harvest rate is around 60 years old. So basically this Kirtland Warbler habitat management will also sound like benefit the Connecticut Warbler as the jackpine ages out of Kirtland Warbler habitat, it will age into Connecticut Warbler habitat. So that is very exciting as well, and hopeful. I'm very optimistic. So yeah, that's basically in a nutshell what I have going on in Michigan. Are there any questions?
I think I would supplement with the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. For those of you who don't know, pretty sparsely populated, a lot of public land, and so that's why you hear all these national forests. The national forests do some monitoring work, and there was a second breeding bird atlas completed there not too long ago, but it kind of, if I understand right, if I remember right, things kind of became disorganized near the end of it, and some of the results aren't really clearly accessible. Excuse me. And I think the point is it's not really well monitored in the Upper Peninsula outside of the national forest where they do some targeted point counts for certain species. And as such, you would think, okay, maybe there's some places it's squirreled away out there. And just talking with the folks, some really hotshot birders that spend a lot of time there, the anecdotal observations are just not there. And these are folks that are getting off the road, hitting the swamps, looking for those boreal specialty species, things like that. So I think there's a really good chance that they're probably gone from all of the UP as kind of the take-home message. I would say we probably need a champion for the Connecticut Warbler in Michigan. So Brianne, I don't know who that would be, but it's something that we should probably think about, because nobody's beating that drum right now. Any questions or comments for Brianne? All right, so that wraps up then I don't see anything in the chat either. That wraps up the US update. Again, just to put it all together, essentially gone for Michigan, nearly so in Wisconsin with some glimmers of hope. And best numbers remaining in Minnesota, but also declining there and retreating northward into that north central area, peatlands area of high, relatively high abundance. Alexis, did you want to put a bow on the US portion in any other way or anything to add?
I don't think so. Yeah, it looks like we have about 4 minutes until Adam is able to join us. Is that right, Brian?
Yeah, Marcel, were you going to start or was Adam going to start?
Yeah, I'm going to start. I've alerted him that that we're about to go on. Just so everyone knows, he was asked to teach a class this morning, so trying to finish up with that. But I can start, and I have his material. We've got it in a joint file, so if I have to start going into stuff before he can join, it's fine. I understand it well enough, and he can answer questions when he comes. So
well, that's great. Why don't we do that then? We'll transition over to our partners in Canada. So first up is going to be this overview of the Canadian perspective holistically, and that led to Adam offering to provide kind of a standardized presentation of breeding bird survey results. And so we decided we would team up Adam and Marcel to give us the whole picture before we burrow down at the more local level. So take it away, Marcel.
All right, thank you, Ryan. I'll share my screen and we'll get this up there. So there we go.
We can see it.
Okay, perfect. Just get back on my screen. There we go. So yeah, this is going to be an initial overview for Canada. We did not coordinate with our provincial counterparts, so there may be a couple of duplications, but I've left things like breeding bird atlases and more localized things like habitat to them. So hopefully the pieces will all come together fairly well. So I thought I'd start with the map from the Boreal Avian Modeling Project, and you know, it shows the overall distribution that's commonly mapped is there in that kind of thin outline, and then showing in the greens are the relative densities, and really the main point here is that the density of distribution from observations doesn't quite match what's necessarily mapped as breeding range. But also that really the core is very distinctly from you know, Alberta through to central Manitoba, and once you get into Ontario, it's sparser. And of course, the U.S. isn't represented in this. This is the reverse of what happens sometimes with like weather maps that end at the border. In this case, this modeling doesn't extend, but you know, we know already from what we've heard over the past half hour that the density in the US is unfortunately getting to be quite low in the small part of the range that there is there. So you'd already mentioned the partners in flight estimate, and what I did here was also add the BAM estimate, which, as you can see, is quite a bit higher. So about 4.7 million based on BAM versus about 1.7 million from partners in flight. I should mention that another of the hats that I wear is as the chair of the Population Estimates Working Group for Partners in Flight, and we're in the process of trying to update all of the estimates that are there. You know, as was mentioned earlier, all of these estimates, especially for a species like this, are somewhat uncertain, and you can see that from the ranges that are indicated here. But even across other species, we realize that there's room for improvement. So we're hopeful that within the next couple of years, there will be a new set of figures out. And that one of the things we're looking at is how can we explore the systematic differences between some of these methods and figure out a way to come up with something that we are more confident is closer to the actual number. There's obviously a lot of assumptions behind that, and we won't get into that for now. But the point of this slide is mostly to show that yes, the Canadian total is 97% of the population, and within that, Saskatchewan, according to the Partners in Flight breakdown, is the core. But when you look at the BAM mapping, it would seem that actually the largest part of the population is in Alberta. And again, different approaches, and it just reflects some of the uncertainty out there. Another way of looking at it is in terms of the provincial rankings. I won't go into this in much detail because the provinces may comment, but basically you can see on the left in 2010, most provinces had it listed as secure S5. By 2015, there were no S5s left. So Alberta, Alberta, Manitoba, and Ontario had gone to apparently secure, and Quebec had gone from secure to vulnerable. Curiously, 2020, which hasn't yet been put up graphically, the Saskatchewan status improved from imperiled to apparently secure, and Ontario went from apparently secure to secure. And I'm not really sure what would have caused such optimism, but maybe that's something that the provinces can comment on when they have their turns. This is the really sobering one, and some of you have probably seen this. It's the Audubon Science climate projections, which they have up for all species. And Connecticut Warbler is really one of the more grim scenarios, where even if you look at just the 1.5 degree Celsius increase scenario, 85% of the range is projected to be lost. and there's only that narrow band of blue up top that's indicating projected range gain. Now, these are of course projections. There's a lot of assumptions that go into these, and I'd be surprised if it's quite as dramatic as this. But I think the climate change issue is something that we are seeing at the southern edge of the range of various boreal breeding species, and I'm sure that it has some impact on this. And I think, particularly for the U.S. populations, it's something that is going to have to be discussed in terms of what potential there is at all for continued existence in that part of the range. So I mentioned too in my introduction that I'm a member of CSIWIC, and one of the things that we do is at our annual bird subcommittee meeting, we consider what species which have not yet been assessed by the committee should be considered for review. And we usually have a list of about 30 or so candidate species on the go at any one time. And unfortunately, time and budget limitations being what they are, we only have the capacity to begin 2 or 3 new reports per year. So it's really only the species that get right up to the top of that list as being urgent or very clearly endangered that are the ones that tend to go forward. So Connecticut Warbler, I think we've probably been discussing it for a good 5 or 6 years. Obviously we've seen declines and had concerns expressed to us as well, but we've really struggled to advance it because we have limitations on data. As you'll see in a minute, the breeding bird survey provides some coverage, but it's not great, and there's large uncertainty bounds around that, just as there are around the population estimates. And so when you put it into the assessment framework, and so for everyone's context, CSIWIC uses the IUCN approach to status assessment, and there's a few criteria that can be used, including one that looks strictly at the rate of population decline, and others that factor in population size and restricted distribution. So considering that the Canadian population is somewhere in the low millions, it doesn't really qualify for any of those low population things. And it would really only trigger a status in Canada by virtue of its rate of decline. And that's where we have that uncertainty. If it's not declining much, it could be determined not at risk. Based on the recent rates of decline, it might be considered special concern or threatened. But if you look at something like the previous slide from the Audubon projections indicating a very substantial loss of range and presumably corresponding loss of population, one could potentially project a rate of loss of more than 50% in the future or in a future period, which could get it to endangered. So that's one of the reasons why we felt uncomfortable putting it forward for CSIWIC assessment at this point, because it would be very difficult to propose and defend a particular status level given all the uncertainty around it, and perhaps something that will come out of, well, probably to say today's discussion is a little bit optimistic, but if something more comes out of this, is a more focused understanding of what the threats and outlook for the species is, and that may facilitate this going forward. So, Adam, if you're on, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, you're here. That is perfect. I will then turn it over to you, and you can talk about the BBS.
Super. Thanks, Marcel. And I'm sorry, everyone, for parachuting in at the last minute. I screwed up in my scheduling, and there was a class I was helping to teach and blah, blah, blah. Anyways, here I am. I'm sorry I've missed everything up until this point. But so yeah, I guess what I was hoping to add in here is, in a nutshell, these key messages. I have a bunch of other slides, but if I think this is the points that I think are worth making about the BBS data and what they say about Connecticut Warbler. And so you know, essentially in the last sort of 20 to 30 years, it's stable. Sorry, in the first 25 years or so, it's increasing or stable through much of the West, much of its range, for the most part. But across the range, it's been decreasing since then, and at varying rates and in varying levels of sort of patchiness, which I'll get to in a second. Yeah, there are some sort of thresholds of decline that according to the BBS have been crossed, some sort of standard thresholds of rates of decline that have been crossed, at least in the US portion of the range. Generally, the decline is less extreme in Canada, and there's no strong evidence in the BBS necessarily to support some sort of shifting north process, but the BBS, I don't know, there's only a handful of points up there that could really inform on that, but there are a few points and they don't show it so far, I guess, is really all I wanted to add to that. So yeah, if we skip the next one,
Adam,
what I'm going to show you here is
Adam, real quick, similarly, does it show any east to west shift or not that either?
No.
Okay.
No, good question, but not as far as I've seen. Yeah, there's really, I don't know. Actually, I'll take that back. I'll come back to that.
Okay.
Yeah. So what I'm going to show you here is a sort of a multiple possible models. It's not a single model. What's the word I'm looking for? Single approach to estimating what the BBS shows us about the species. There's a bunch of different models here. We won't go into the details of the models specifically because they're not terribly critical, but I think that the comparison amongst models, the kinds of inferences that are consistent in many models are probably more reliable than the kinds of inferences that vary depending on the model, that kind of thing. And so that's why I've got a bunch of models in here. So next slide, please. So here's a plot of the long on the left, 66 through 2021, and the short term, the last 10-year trend estimates from 4 different models. Like I said, the models are not terribly important, but I'm more than happy to nerd out on them if anyone's interested. And they're sorted based on, well, you can see the bottom, the continental, and the country level estimates are down at the bottom. Oh, you can't see my pointer, sorry. And then the province and state ones are sorted by country and then also by sort of overall average rate of decline. The red lines and the orange lines in the graphs indicate rates of decline that would result in a 30 or a 50% decline over 10 years. And so you can see that sort of threshold is certainly, most of the models suggest that it's past that threshold in the US over the last 10 years, at least. And one of them suggests it might even have hit the 50% decline rate. But there's lots of uncertainty across all of these things. And you can also see that, certainly in the northern edge of the species range in the Northwest, there's a lot of variation, a lot of uncertainty within models. The credible intervals are really wide there on the trend estimates. And the inferences are very model dependent. At the northern edge of the species range, one model might say it's increasing, one other model say it's decreasing. And we'll flip to the next slide. In general, trend estimates are very particular values. They're a very particular parameter. It estimates a rate of change over a particular time interval. Even though those trends vary, the trend estimates themselves might look like they vary a lot, the overall trajectories are pretty consistent across the different models. What you see is that sort of increasing or stable for the first 25 years, and then pretty clear declines since then. And the next slide, please. And there's those same collection of trajectories for the regional or the state and province level estimates. The black dots on here are the observed average mean counts in that region, and the darkness of the black dot reflects the number of routes that were actually surveyed in that region at that year. And so A couple of things that you can see from that. Number one, the trajectories for the most part follow those observed means, which is great. If there is some wild variation, they shouldn't follow it exactly, of course, because that's the whole point of the model. We want to account for the other things that are influencing this, the observers, which routes are surveyed in any given year, that sort of thing. But you can also see that in, again, the data in the northern portion and to some extent in the northwestern portion of the species range are very sparse. You know, Northwest Territories, there are no data in the first 15 to 20 years. So the long-term trend there is really just borrowing information from the rest of the species range, and we don't have a lot to go on really when it comes right down to it. And similarly in Quebec, where we might see some of that eastern spread, you know, there does seem to be an increase over time in Quebec, but I think there's one route in Quebec in the first sort of 20, 25 years. It might be two. Bruno, you probably actually know the answer to that specifically.
Yeah, well, it's not an expansion. It's just a discovery of the bird in a habitat where people don't go very much and where there is not BBS routes. So it was a well-established population that had just been discovered, but it was there before.
Yeah.
But the recent declines in your graph is fitting what we see, the threats we see on the ground. While I'm talking, just a quick question, Adam, can we conclude from those graphs that there could be a habitat relation between habitat-dependent relation with what's happening in the States, where habitat condition was not good in the past, and the habitat improved, and then now the habitat is declining? How do you explain this kind of U-shape, reverse U-shape, or N-shaped curve?
So that's a great question, and that's we have lots of potential to explore that specifically. If we had temporal information on habitat conditions on the ground through time, then these BBS data would probably lend themselves really well to that kind of analysis. So. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the species well enough. I've actually never seen one. I don't even know the species well enough to have anything to contribute to that other than yeah, cool, let's do that. Yeah, so in a nutshell, you know, the two regions in the you know, Minnesota and Wisconsin, there's great data there. They're fairly dark points. There are quite a few routes, and there's a pretty consistent signal across those routes of that increase and that decline. And I'll get back to that route level summary as well. The one other thing I want to point out too is that the early increase in Alberta, there does seem to be an early increase in that period of time in a lot of regions, but the Alberta data also are pretty sparse in the first portion of the time series. You can see that the dots are getting a lot darker as you move forward in time in Alberta, and so so that early portion is relying on a lot fewer data than the more recent stable-ish population trajectory. Uncertainty abounds. But having said that, across those regions, there are some consistent patterns that suggest an increase and then stable or a decline, stable in best case scenario in only one region, but essentially a decline everywhere else since then. Okay. Drop down. Okay, so this graph is a graph Marcel and I and some others have been kind of gradually evolving this graph. So this is not a population trajectory. So curving upwards does not mean an increasing population. This is a sort of rolling estimate of short-term trends. So each point on the graph represents a 10-year trend that ended in, for example, 1980, and ended in the year on the x-axis. And so the first point on the continental plot here is the 10-year trend from 1970 to 1980. The next one is the 10-year trend from 1971 to 1981 and forward. And so if the points are below the black line, that's a declining population. And the rate at which it's declining, well, obviously it drops lower if it's declining faster. The point of this kind of plot is to give you a sense of two things. Number one, how has that trend been changing over time? So thinking about status assessments, is the species status getting better or worse? Is it declining faster, or is the decline ameliorating a little bit if it's sort of trending upwards towards that zero line? And it also gives you a sense of how variable our assessment or status assessment would be if we assessed it in any particular year. And so, I mean, in a nutshell, you can see that within Canada, there's a period of time there around 2010 where it would have crossed that kind of 30% decline in 10 years threshold, at least in terms of the point estimate. Again, lots of uncertainty in those credible intervals. And in the United States, that portion of the population has been below that 30% decline threshold since the early 90s, since that really steep peak in the population trajectory. And in some periods of time, and according to some models, it's even below that 50% per 10-year period decline rate. Next graph. And there's the same thing for the different regions. Very few points above the black line anywhere in these, at least in the more recent time periods, although lots of points above the line in a black line in the early portion of the time series. Yeah, I mean, these sorts of plots, and we can look at the different models. Different models suggest different things at this sort of finer scale, which makes sense. Fewer data, so there's a little more, the inferences are a little more model dependent. But in general, there's a fairly good consistent signal here.
Yeah, I would just add that from the Canadian perspective, when we look at whether to proceed with it as the Kasiwak assessment, for example, you can look at the Alberta and Saskatchewan as both being at or around stable levels. And if you think back to near the beginning of the presentation with those having the largest populations, that's what would give us cause to wonder, how high of a conservation priority it is in Canada relative to other species. So that's just one of the things that we consider.
Yeah. And there's the sort of geographic spread of the most recent 10-year trend. Again, there's fairly consistent sort of stable-ish, sort of very minor declines, but otherwise, all the other models suggesting some increase to stable in the northwestern portion of the population and not everywhere else in the recent period of time. And just to remind you of what those population trajectories look like, the overall assessment looks like. The BBS data also provide an opportunity to kind of drill into the spatial, the fine scale spatial information. So there's the overall trajectories, but if you skip down to the next slide, this graph or this map gives you a sense of the locations of the routes and the variation among routes in that signal of increase in the first portion of the time series. So here's the first 25 years. Here's a a route level trend estimate. The little gray dots, and these are the kind of maps that I struggle with to get the size of the dots and the colors of the dots correct. You kind of squint a little bit. I can share high resolution images of this, but the gray dots are routes that were surveyed on which the species during this time period has never been observed. The blue dots are routes where the species has been observed during that time period, and the trend, there seems to be a positive trend. Redder dots are negative trend, and the size of the dot reflects the average counts over that time period on that route. And so what you see here is that, for the first 25 years, yes, there's a signal of increase certainly in the northwest portion. There's lots of signal increase, consistent signal increase in the US portion, but there is some inconsistency in there. There are routes where there's been a decline even in that first, or there's a signal of decline even in that first 25 years, not a few years, first 25 years of the BBS. And if we flip to the next one, there's the same plot, but now for the next 10 years, so 91 through 2001. And then all of a sudden across the board, what you see is, essentially those increases have pretty much disappeared. There's our pockets or a handful of routes where things have gone up, but otherwise the signal decline is pretty consistent across the board. And then finally, the last one is the last 20 years. So this is an interesting thing here, where this signal of increase in the northwest portion of the species range, it's not consistent between this model and the stratum level average change across broader regions model that we generally use to assess the trends in species from the BBS, and so there are pockets of increase here, and if you squint again, in terms of that northern expansion, you see a couple little gray dots along here where the species has not shown up, even though there have been surveys in these regions. Yes, thank you. You're pointing exactly where I'm pointing. Well done. It's like a Ouija board. And in the very top corner, there is a little blue dot. It's really hard to see in the northwestern territories. There it is. There's one route up there on the northern edge where all of a sudden it's shown up. I don't know, but whatever. Anyways, the point is there's some inconsistency in space to that conclusion that it has been increasing in the northwest portion of its range. It's even though all of the models at the stratum level suggest that there's pretty much an increase, it's not super clear from those data that that's really a consistent pattern across that whole portion of the species range. So there you go. I hope that was useful, and it wasn't totally overwhelming everyone with uncertainty. But yeah, there you go.
No, it's fantastic, Adam. Thank you. Especially these latest graphics, I particularly thought were very telling. So thank you for all that hard work. Likewise, Marcel. We don't have time for questions this time, but I'm sure we can circle back to some of these inconsistencies and when we talk about research and monitoring and maybe what some needs are moving forward this afternoon. All right, so next up, we're going to head down into each of the provinces. We're going to move east to west and start in Quebec with Bruno. So Bruno, share your screen and take it away. We can see it. You're muted. Bruno, you are muted. Unmute.
Right, sorry, I'm not used with Zoom and I was not finding the unmute button.
You're back.
So, right, English is not my first language, so just bear with me if there is things you don't understand, just ask question. So the main person doing research in Quebec is Jacques Barzabal, who is also on the call. So I will be talking about the work he's done. So I'm talking about Quebec, which is the eastern part of the Connecticut Warbler distribution, the easternmost part of it. And this is the data from eBird from June and July in the last 10 years. And basically in Quebec, we have three kind of population. The one in the west, A, the one along Lake St. John area, as Lake St. John area, B, and some sporadic occurrences on the St. Lawrence North Shore. Here are the results from the breeding bird survey, the breeding bird atlas survey, the second one. And as you can see, the population in the west. We don't know much about the population, this area here, because there is not very few people around. And as you can see, the population B is retrieving, so there is a reduction in the distribution in this area. I will talk more about that. And from the sea population on North Shore is being seen during the breeding bird atlas. But when you look at the Cornell map distribution of the species, it's really interesting because we can see that with the eBird data, we see that the bird is no longer what it used to be in the Saguenay area. Is not, there is no habitat modeled by Cornell in the sea population, which is what we expect because it's kind of a sporadic occurrences. But Cornell is modeling potential habitat in places where we don't have data. So this is very interesting. And as I said to previously, the population here is recently discovered, but they've always been there. But the fact that the bird population is located only on jack pine forest, it was recently discovered because that's not where the birds go in the summer. It's a place where there is very few species. The bird is singing very early in the morning. It's a place where it's very warm and muzzy in the summer. It's not a place where you go for birding in the morning. And so a bird was discovered recently, but we think that it was always there. It was very interesting to hear from the States that the bird was also occurring in jack pine, because that's the only place in Canada where bird is using jack pine. And that's the same kind of habitat that was described before. Mature jack pine forest that is not very dense, but with a really dense cover of shrub undercover. I'm not sitting up here. I'm on my knees. We're waiting for the bird to actually go in the mist net. But you can see that it's a really thick habitat. And it's a habitat where you can, where the bird can go unnoticed very well, because it's like a little mouse. It likes to walk on the ground under this shrub area, especially the male. Male will sing and then will go under the cover, goes to the nest site, goes to the female. And when the male is under the shrubs, as some of them that have worked with the species, it's impossible to catch on a mist net. Other pictures of the habitat where we find the species. And it's always been interesting in Canada. When I was talking to where we find a bird in Quebec, people in the rest of Canada doesn't really understand that it's fine in jack pine, because probably it's mostly fine in wetland or aspen in the rest of the country. But I went in Ontario, coming from Ontario in year 2019. I stopped at the place that I thought that for me was perfect Connecticut Warbler habitat, and I found the species. And it was on a jack pine forest. So it also occurs in Ontario, and I'm wondering if people just don't go there to find the species because they don't assume it's there. But I was also happy to say that the model of Baudry in 2010 shows that it should be in jack pine area, and people this morning show that it was in jack pine area as well. But my main message is that the jack pine forest in Quebec is at threat by habitat conversion for blueberry farming, and this is not forestry; it's deforestation. So it's a net loss of habitat. So this is just to give you an example. June 2018. June 2019, it's been completely clear cut and stump grinding, and 3 years after, it's blueberry farming all over. And it's a major and permanent conversion for the habitat. And here it was a jack pine forest once, but it's now a blueberry farm. And this blueberry production has been increasing a lot since 2001. It's now stabilized in a way, but it's been increasing. It's a big market in the east. Just to give you an example, this is 1985, where we find, this is all jack pine, deltaic depot from the last glaciation, where you find very flat area, very well drained, dry, the kind of place where you will find jack pine. And that is in 1985. That was the only blueberry in the area where you find Connecticut Warbler. This is 2022, and that's all the habitat that is being destroyed and converted to blueberry farming. So it's a real concern for us in the east. And we were signing this paper in 2020 that people knows about, that is showing a decline in the breeding ground for that species, and that's what we experience in Quebec. So it fits what we experience in the province. And one of the questions we have is, can we find a way to actually have blueberry farm and also find allowing cohabitation with Connecticut warblers. So the University of Quebec in Chicoutimi is working with experimental blueberry farm and experimental blueberry farm forest, where they look at that. And we think that since the bird kind of like nesting near the edge, it could be there could be a way to manage the area for a blueberry and conserve the Connecticut warbler breeding area. So in a nutshell, there is no special status in Quebec. Province in Quebec doesn't really care or doesn't really have time to work on migratory bird. They leave that for the Canadian Wildlife Service. And the Canadian Wildlife Service have a national perspective. And so if we were doing an assessment only for Quebec, it may have it might be considered as a special risk under the provincial law, but it haven't been assessed. But under the federal law, because of the national perspective, although it is the distribution is reducing and there is a decline from what we can see on the BBS, it doesn't have a status because it doesn't fit the national perspective. The Connecticut warbler in Quebec prefers the high coverage of the ericaceae, Labrador tea, sheep laurel, and blueberry shrubs, particularly blueberries, low plant density when plants are taller, the proximity of edge. We found that a lot of the nests that have been studied by the university was near the edge. It avoids open areas and moss or lichen area. And the big question for us is there a way to manage the forests and blueberry farms so to provide quality breeding ground for Connecticut warbler? And I will just stop saying that there was a lot of work being done at the university monitoring the breeding, the nest site, breeding pairs with color band. A lot of that is being published in French, so it's not available in English. Junior and I and Jacques can relate to that if you have questions. We've been studying, Jacques has been working on telemetry to understand the behavior of the male and the female. And one of the work that I have no time to talk about is the linguistic work that Jacques done on Connecticut warbler. And it will be really interesting to go in more detail, maybe in another workshop, but Jacques was able to actually, by working on the linguistic, he developed a way to code the song of the Connecticut warbler, and he was able to see the variation among the season from one individual, but to work out the specificity from areas that have different dialects. And also I don't want to go too much into detail because I don't know those details, but it was very interesting that the whole way of studying the variation between individual and the variation between within an individual without doing genetic work, but only on linguistic. And on that, we also took a blood sample and that we contributed to the Genoscape project, but we haven't heard from that since. And just to finish, I've done a work that has been published as a CWS technical report on the nesting phonology of birds in Canada. And we did study the few data, the 11 data we have on the project Nest Watch for the Connecticut warbler. And as you see, the red dot shows where the data come from. We were able to predict when birds are nesting, when birds are initiating the nesting period with nest laying, and when the fledgling are leaving the nest. But as you can see on the model, there is a lot of uncertainty and imprecision because of the few nests we have. But it's probably interesting for you to know that we've been modeling that in Canada. So I don't know if I took more than 10 minutes, But with that, I stop sharing and I'm ready for question.
Thanks, Bruno. I think we're going to have to continue on. We'll, if anyone has a question, leave it in the chat. That was fascinating. Excellent summary. Thank you. And I would also suggest maybe that some of those latter research projects could come up later in our research and monitoring section when we brainstorm kind of the recent work that has taken place. So next up will be Mike from Ontario. Take it away, Mike.
Yeah, all right, thanks. I'm actually going to tag team this with my colleague Kevin
Excellent.
Hanna. And Kevin, I think you've got the slides you could share.
Yep.
Perfect.
How's that look?
Good. Take it away.
Okay, so I'm just going to present some preliminary results of some work we've done in Ontario, and Mike's going to follow up the rear with some additional information from the province's perspective. So just to sort of zoom out and show you where we've been working, this is some eBird generated data range map. I tend to prefer it over existing maps because I think they're pretty limited in terms of their northern coverage. But you can see again, sorry, it's little black dots or little dots that you got to try and see. But just to put you in perspective, we're surveying in the north central part of the breeding range. So that's what the sort of line and these dots represent. If we want to zoom in to the province level, you can see here in relation to where there's existing data in eBird relative to where we worked. I'll point out that 2019 is this Transect survey. That's this sort of long line that runs north-south. And then 2021 is the series of dots that sort of form a circle in here. So it's kind of a combined effort of trying to get some baseline information in this region for a big proposed mining development that's about to happen. I'll point out there's no roads in this area at all, and probably we're about 200 kilometers north of where roads exist. I don't have that layer on this map, but just to give you that perspective. So all this work is done by helicopter deployments of autonomous recording units. So they're out there for the entire season, and we transcribe that data. And so if you look at the right panel here, it's a sort of a zoom in of those sites, and you can see the count data for these. There's a lot of sites here that have 3 birds detected and quite a few with 2 and lots with 1. There was a table attached with this. I'll just have to sort of mention it because it doesn't appear like it showed up. But for all our sites here, there was a 44% occupancy rate. So almost half of the sites where we sampled picked up at least one Connecticut Warbler. And I think it was something like 5% of sites had 3 birds detected. So there's good numbers here. Beyond, I guess, again, like I say, the rodent network. And the next, oh, there it is. I just had to go down one number. So it's about 230 sites. And again, about 44% of those sites detected at least one Connecticut Warbler. Most had 1, a few with 2, and very few with 3. So just the sites with 3 birds, I've sort of tabulated the habitats those birds are in this table in the upper left. So most of the sites where we're picking up 3 birds are called flat bog. There's also flat swamp and ribbed fen, but predominantly flat bog is where these birds are occurring in these counts of 3. And this is what flat bog looks like. So it's widely spaced black spruce that are fairly stunted, like, 2 to 6 meter height, with a fairly complex shrub cover, sort of like Bruno was showing from Quebec. But sorry, my categories are blocked here by the big band at the top, so I can't tell you what these are from my perspective, but if you can see them, then that's great. I'll also mention too that Ontario is in the 2nd year of the 3rd round of the Provincial Breeding Bird Atlas. And this is just a quick summary of some of the detections of Connecticut Warbler from other counts related to the 3rd Breeding Bird Atlas. And again, these are colored based on the count data, so 1, 2, and 3. Very few detections of 3 birds. And you can see just outside of the area where we've been working, there's quite a few sites. This looks like probably a river transect that was done by canoe or something, but quite a few sites with a count of 2. And elsewhere, it's mostly 1 or 2 birds that are being detected. And sort of summarizing some of the habitat associations of birds based on that long linear transect I showed you that we did in 2019. I'll just point out that Connecticut warbler here, I've highlighted it in red or circled it in red, is predominantly occurring in fen habitats and also bog habitats, and very little swamp, but almost no forest at all. And quite similar actually to, if you go down a few species, blackpoll warbler, which occurs in this area as well, has very similar habitat associations, which is kind of interesting because I think in most parts of the Connecticut warbler range, you wouldn't find them associating or wouldn't think of them associating with habitats suitable for blackpoll warbler. But another species where it's kind of a similar situation, major declines in the last decades, and probably north of where we have reasonably systematic surveys. So might be a companion species to think about for future work. And I think that's all I have, and then I'll hand it over to Mike here.
All right, thanks, Kevin. So yeah, Kevin mentioned we're into year 3 of the 3rd Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas. So we don't have a lot of results yet for number 3. This is a few of the maps that came out of Atlas number 2. Basically give you an idea of where it's breeding in Ontario. I will point out that a pretty big chunk of that middle map is just white, and that's sort of right in the middle of that lowlands, thanks Kevin, is where Kevin's doing some of those ARU deployments. And it's just an area that is just incredibly hard to get into. And so it didn't really get any survey coverage aside from some remote river trips during Atlas 2. So we're really excited to see what those deployments of ARUs by helicopter are able to show us during Atlas number 3. The relative abundance map on the right, that comes from point counts. It's basically showing you we've got higher density kind of in the western half of northern Ontario, but I mean, those are just from point counts, and our point count coverage is pretty limited north of the roads, which is really the northern half of that map. It's really just we're the only point counts we were able to get done in Atlas 2 in those remote areas are mostly from river trips. So the habitat is kind of skewed that is being covered from that perspective. You can go to the next slide there, Kevin. This is just a quick excerpt from some of the calculations that were done between Atlas 1 and Atlas 2 in terms of probability of observation. So this is where we start to get confused about what's really happening with the species. We've got BBS giving us a trend, a negative trend, but in terms of probability of observation, we saw a huge increase between Atlas 1 and Atlas 2. It was almost 100% increase in the Hudson Bay lowlands, and part of that is possibly explained by changes in coverage, better coverage in Atlas 2, but that was taken into account. To some degree. I'm not an expert on the analyses that were conducted for this, but this is what we're seeing, a significant increase in probability of observation in both the Northern Shield and the Hudson Bay lowlands during Atlas 2. All right, next slide. This is a photo that came out of a 2011 paper. This is actually the very first documented nest in Ontario. So it really speaks to the secretive nature of the species, but also to the remoteness that the species inhabits here in Ontario, that we only had our first documented nest basically in the past decade, which is pretty mind-blowing to me. But you get a sense of the habitat. It's similar to what everybody's been talking about. This was in sort of central northern Ontario, near Lake Nipigon. So mostly we're talking about, like Kevin said, sort of tamarack, spruce, fens, very open, very sparsely treed with a really dense layer of ericaceous shrubs. That seems to be what people think of as the typical habitat in Ontario. But we also have a bit of they're definitely found in sort of similar structured habitat, but with poplar as the dominant tree. especially in the sort of Rainy River area of the province, which is, for those of you who don't know Ontario geography, that's the area that borders on Minnesota and Manitoba. So, but definitely the photo you're seeing here is what I think most people think of as typical Connecticut warbler habitat in Ontario. All right, I think I got one more there, Kevin. Oh yeah, so this one was just a placeholder. I was hoping to put in some trend information that come from our bird observatories in the province. We have two big ones. Well, we have more than two big ones, but we have two that have generally good trends for a lot of migrant species. And neither of them have good enough data for Connecticut warbler, which speaks to, again, the secretive nature of the species. It's very hard to detect. This is one I managed to see in Southern Ontario in my spring migration, and I had to track this one down. I could hear it singing. I literally crawled on my hands and knees through some shrubs until I was like 10 feet away from it. But I couldn't see it until I was almost on top of it, even though I could hear it singing. So yeah, they're a tough one to find and hard to monitor here in the province, but we're excited about what some of this future work is going to show us. That's it for us in Ontario. I don't know if there's time for questions or if we're just going to move on. That's fine too.
Somebody have one quick one? Okay, we will move on. Thank you very much, Mike and Kevin. Next up will be Manitoba. I believe maybe Tim and Kevin might be tag teaming on this one.
Yeah, Tim's gonna start.
Yeah. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So I'm having a technical issue here. There we go. That'll do. Okay. So yeah, Kevin's going to talk a bit at the end of this about some of his research, but I'm going to sort of cover the most of this. Also, before I start, just to acknowledge that Christian Artuso, who's not here today, provided a lot of the information for this, given his background with the Manitoba Breeding Bird Atlas, which is really informing much of what we know about Connecticut Warbler range in Manitoba. There we go. So before sort of moving on, Mike was just talking about the first documented nest there in Ontario just back in 2012. Well, the first one apparently to Western science was actually found in Manitoba back in 1883 by Ernest Thompson Seton. We have a bit of a history in Manitoba with this species, but again, the secretive nature of it's made it very difficult to establish what the range has been historically for many years. The Birds of Manitoba, which was published in 2003, gave a range which was north of Lake Winnipeg, well into the Boreal Softwood Shield. And that was actually more accurate than the range it's given in Birds of the Wild, the range that Ryan showed at the beginning of his talk. If you look at the map on the right-hand side here, if you look at that sort of that hump in Ontario, and you sort of hold that as a thought, then you come to the Manitoba Breeding Bird Atlas. You see that range that was mapped in Ontario actually sweeps across through Manitoba itself. One second, just get my notes here. So during the Manitoba Breeding Bird Atlas, we've only had one so far. Connecticut Warbler was detected in 447 squares. And the Atlas results showed that the species nests throughout the Boreal Softwood Shield are by a very localized sort of clump distribution, and right up to the edge of the Tiger Shield and the Hudson Plains, and southward just into the prairie potholes. The highest percentage of occupied squares was in the Boreal Hardwood transition zone, so right in the southeast corner, bordering Ontario and Minnesota. The Atlas results also showed that basically the nesting distribution of Connecticut Warbler was 150 kilometers north of that depicted in the Birds of Manitoba, and actually 400 kilometers north of the range depicted in Birds of the Wild. So the range was really underestimated, and we're not showing range expansion here. We're just we're just demonstrating how little we actually knew about the distribution of this species before that period, 2009 to 2014. So this is our relative abundance in Manitoba. And you can see from the map, we have very high relative abundance, well, high for here anyway, east of Lake Winnipeg. And in patches throughout the interlake, this is called the interlake here, if you can see my cursor, and around the Duck Mountain, which is Duck Mountains here, and the Porcupine Hills here on the border with Saskatchewan. 14 of the 15 highest squares with the highest average abundance were actually all roadless, with the one exception only having 1.3 kilometers of roads. So it also suggests that there is that Connecticut warblers avoid human habitation, they avoid roadsides. And this whole area to the east of Lake Winnipeg here, that is effectively just wilderness. That's mostly flying areas. People had been flown into to do atlasing in those areas. That current distribution of the species also led to high local abundance, over 1.7 individuals per 15 point counts in some areas. And there was a peak of actually 30 individuals on 15 point counts along the Pigeon River, which is here in this area. And you can see this is the aerial shot of that square. And just looking at area square, this sort of the area square, this segues into habitat, you could just sort of make out that there's a lot of wetland here. This is mature conifer forest with a large proportion of wetland. Oh, and here's the eBird distribution as well, which again sort of kind of matches the atlas distribution as well. But that's what I meant. That's what I thought I was going to. The habitat in Manitoba. What I talking to a few people when I was preparing for this. The thing that comes out with habitat is it's usually dead flat. So the big escarpment, sort of the most escarpment boreal forests such as Ryder Mountain National Park, don't have you don't have Connecticut warbler on the escarpment itself. It's on, you find them on the flats, and dead flat was what I was told. So the photo at the top here from Peter Taylor, who's one of the ground birders of Manitoba. Obviously, this is sort of a winter shot, but the areas that you find them, it's generally this. It's flat terrain, often around cedar bogs, black spruce and tamarack bogs with a Labrador tea understory, conifer stands with peat moss, boreal wetland edges with alder and willow swales, jack pine stands, including those with sandy soils, poplar stands, especially where there's open canopies around Ryder Mountain, so sort of on the edges of the prairie potholes. So we're getting a real mixture of different habitat types. And like everyone else, low understory with open areas, ericaceous vegetation is very important. And that multi-layered undergrowth with shrubs, saplings, and vegetated peat hummocks. So finally, before I pass across to Kevin, legal status in Manitoba. I've obviously Adam covered the BBS trends, and that's the only trend information that we have from Manitoba, but it's not currently listed on our Endangered Species Act. We tend to mirror CSEWIC and the Federal Species at Risk Act with our when we designate a species in Manitoba. And it is included obviously as a migratory bird listed under our Wildlife Act, but in general, I think Quebec said this, we leave, because it's a migratory bird, in general in Manitoba, we allow the federal government to lead on this species. Finally, the current NatureServe ranking is S3, S4B, and that was a drop, I think, from the previous one, according to Marcel's map that he showed earlier. So I'm going to pass across to Kevin, and he's just going to talk a wee bit about some of the geotag work, which probably segues into this afternoon as well.
Sure, great, thanks, Tim. So I helped out with this project a few years ago that was led by Emily McKinnon, and this is the resulting paper of that work where you can read more detail than I can present today. Emily wasn't able to join us for the chat today. So the title here, Mystery of the Missing Warbler, kind of alludes to we've been talking about for the species, particularly on migration, and this project was aimed at sort of trying to address some of the major gaps we've got in the migration ecology of the species. Next slide, please, Tim, if you could. So this was a project that Tim just showed the range covering, much of eastern Manitoba. This project was working in fairly accessible sites just about an hour east of Winnipeg. So there are some sites we can get to fairly easily from where we're based here at the University of Manitoba to do the work. It was very helpful to have the Manitoba Breeding Bird Atlas being just in sort of the final stages when the project began, because we had sort of fresh locations where we find breeding Connecticut warblers. Oh, somebody's saying that it's breaking up a bit. Are people able to hear me? Yes, good.
We can hear you. You kind of stagger sometimes, but you have always come back, at least so far.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's typical. So we had a lot of locations fairly nearby, and like others have been saying, the sort of the overarching characteristic, even though we didn't study habitat specifically, was that they were very open. We found them in a lot of open sort of poplar forest, some by roadsides, very accessible sites along small gravel roadways in the Agassiz forest. Some sites were a little denser and in one case a small boat to get to, but all just within about an hour of Winnipeg. So 29 geolocators went out, 4 were retrieved in the following year. These are sort of archival devices. We were aiming to get all of fall migration. There was a 5th one retrieved that wasn't included in this paper, so we don't have data for that. Next slide. So these are the maps that are in the paper. They might be a bit small to see, but what was amazing here was this huge eastward movement. So mostly a long migration first to the east coast of the US from our sites here in Manitoba. You can just imagine the gauntlet of urban development that these Connecticut warblers are passing through on their way to the east coast. Just as a small anecdote, I found one as a window kill when I was at York University in Toronto during fall migration. And then sort of the amazing thing here with these huge taking 40 hours out over Atlantic Ocean, and then leading down to the Greater Antilles, where there were some stopovers as well, and then another final crossing down to South America. So we didn't Emily didn't focus too much on the wintering sites here, because that was followed up on by my so we presented that bit. The focus here was fall migration. So still sort of a nice start, but still some major gaps in migration timing, migration phenology. We don't have anything for spring migration. These devices only lasted long enough to get the fall migration. So lots still to do here in terms of migration and stopover and timing and potential mismatches with good conditions all around the calendar. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Kevin, and Tim as well. If you have a question, you can leave it in the chat. And again, I think this study will come up again this afternoon, would be my guess, and maybe even in Mike's Wintering Grounds talk coming up soon. So next up, we're going to move over to Saskatchewan, and I think Steve's going to take the lead on this one. Steve.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll just share my screen here. Oops. Okay.
We can see it.
Good. So this is a very brief update of status of Canada or Connecticut Warbler in Saskatchewan. Been able to benefit from some recent survey efforts. I'm part of a team across Canada trying to expand surveys beyond the breeding bird survey into a broader swath of the boreal forest. So my program started in 2014 and includes all of Saskatchewan's boreal forest. So far, this in the program, I've managed to cover all the major eco zones in the province, dealing with several thousands of point count stations, as well as hundreds of primary sample units in which the samples are clustered. We've also benefited from having our first breeding bird atlas in Saskatchewan, which just wrapped up. Unfortunately, had to do the final 2 years of the atlas during the height of the COVID pandemic. So survey efforts in the boreal were a little bit interrupted. All the gray areas appearing on here are areas that were surveyed, and the highlighted sort of orange and reddish colors are atlas squares where we managed to detect Connecticut warblers, much more restricted than what you saw in adjacent Manitoba. Not really picking them up in the boreal softwood shield. I'm not exactly sure why that is, because we've done a lot of the work in the shield with ARUs as well, so, or autonomous recording units. So, you know, there's a lot of repeat surveys at these locations, and we're still not picking them up. So I don't think it's just a detection probability issue. Looking at the data that I managed to collect from 2014 to 2020, about 3% overall of the point count stations have had Connecticut warblers. Obviously, it's a lot higher if I were to break it down to just the very southern portion of the survey area. I didn't have much time to prepare this, so I'm not sure exactly what the sort of occupancy rate is in the southern portion, but we do have counts up to 4 birds per point count, but only at a single location. Traditionally, I think surveys done in Saskatchewan tended to pick the Connecticut warblers up mostly in aspen or in aspen forest next to black spruce bogs, and a lot of work done by Keith Hobson and Erin Bayne in the mid-90s tended to find that, but a lot of that work was very much focused on trying to inform forestry practices, which tended to concentrate on real upland forest types. And my current surveys are a lot more randomized and include everything from black spruce bogs to fens. And like a lot of the work that was described from Manitoba and Ontario, when we tend to get into some of those habitats, we are finding the Connecticut warblers occurring in black spruce and conifer stands in eastern Saskatchewan, mostly in mixed wood forest, but you know, it's sort of a toss up. Sometimes you'll go into a black spruce stand and find them in central Saskatchewan, and sometimes you won't. And then in western Saskatchewan, we're almost exclusively finding them in aspen forests. So I did fit a preliminary species distribution model, and to try to account for that switch in habitat, I used some globally available data sets by an author named Boan et al., where they have interpolated the percent of the forest made up of hardwood versus softwood, et cetera, across all of Canada. And I fit a model where I included percent needle leaf with longitude to try to capture that switch in habitat within Saskatchewan, stand age and stand age squared, as well as a digital elevation model derived product called topographic wetness index, which, similar to some of the earlier discussion about flat areas versus wet areas and that sort of thing, will tend to capture what portions of the landscape are kind of wet. And I fit a zero inflated count model, and in order to capture sort of the broad distribution of the species, I included mean annual temperature as a predictor of whether or not the species might be present locally, and some offsets for detection probability. I won't belabor this table too much. I didn't have time to make graphs of the late relationships. There is some weak evidence that that interaction between needle leaf and longitude exists. So, you know, it might be a little bit stronger relationship if I included data from outside of Saskatchewan. It sort of fits with a lot of the habitat description and the switch in habitat, you know, for example, in Andy Crosby's work. Another major predictor of the distribution was the mean annual temperature. And when we map that out, we see that the species tends to be very much more likely to be detected in the very southern portion of the breeding range in Saskatchewan. Somewhat similar to what the Boreal Avian Modeling Project currently shows for distribution, but perhaps predicting less occurrences in the far north. Some of that could be, you know, the very preliminary nature of my model, but I think also the Boreal Avian Modeling Project has not yet incorporated the data that I collected in the past 8 or so years, and that could be a part of the difference here as well. Most of the data informing this in Saskatchewan comes from those surveys in the early 90s to early 2000s. And some maps of the uncertainty. There's certainly some areas of high prediction uncertainty that would be worthwhile checking out. Say, for example, along the Clearwater River, sort of north, just at the northern edge of where my other map sort of predicts they would be. There's some very good predicted habitat here because of a microclimate around the Clearwater River. Oops. And similar to the population size estimates that Marcel showed, my population size estimate for Saskatchewan sort of has a median of around 650,000, ranging from 337,000 to about 1.3 million. So, and importantly, you know, as I pointed out with the mapping, it's using a different method, except for the same sort of QPAD offsets as the BAM model. And it's also using a completely different spatio-temporal distribution of sampling, but still coming up with very similar estimates. So perhaps there's we can place a little more faith than we previously did in some of those estimates. But that's all I have at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Does anyone have any questions for Steve? No, okay.
Just a quick question, Ryan.
Yes, go ahead, Bruno.
Steve, do you think that there is the BAM model doesn't seem to show potential habitat in Quebec? Do you think it's related to this jack pine thing and lack of data coming from Quebec?
Yeah, I would almost certainly think it's just the volume of data. I mean, maybe Erin can speak to that a bit more since he's perhaps a little bit more familiar with the BAM data and the BAM modeling, but the machine learning approaches are very much driven by the distribution and amount of data. And it's probably very much overwhelmed by the volume of Connecticut Warbler occurrences elsewhere in the range.
Yeah, and perhaps with all the new data that will be incorporated from the east with Junior's work, it will show a better representation of the whole range of the bird.
Hopefully. Erin, did you have anything to add there?
Maybe I'll return to that when if I get to a particular slide, and we could talk a little bit about it.
Okay.
All right, well, that sounds like a good segue to me because Erin is up next and he's going to cover Alberta.
All right. So, and now for something completely different. All right, so the Connecticut Warbler, as we know, in Alberta, it is, well, we may not know it is secure. And it definitely is a species that likes the aspen and the mixed woods. And we can talk a little bit more about the shrubs because I think there's quite a bit of complexity there that we really need to talk about. So here is a map of the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute. Each one of those dots represents a place where 4 ARUs have been placed 600 meters apart sometime in the past decade, essentially. The red dots represent where Connecticut warblers have been detected. The gray dots are the ones that have not been detected, and the really small ones are places just we haven't gone yet. So Connecticut warblers, and for us, are quite a common species. 183, out of approximately, 1,000 sites, 20% of the time in a completely systematic random design, you're going to find them. So definitely not the rarest of the rare, but what I would say is some of the comments I heard earlier, there definitely is distinct clumping of the species. That does happen in Alberta, just like everywhere else. The concept of flat, I would also say, is quite a common phenomenon as well. But this is just to give you an idea of why probably the BBS trends for here just suck, frankly. And most of the BBS in Alberta is done on our road network, and most of it's done in the fragmented agricultural parts, so around Edmonton there, north of Grand Prairie. And that's, that part of the range, and frankly, it's so chopped up, it doesn't really tell us a lot about Connecticut warblers. The rest of these places that are on this figure show, the number of locations, a single ARU where we found them, and it's thousands of locations. And when we take that, we start to build habitat associations. There's quite a bit of information in here. Well, first off, they are found in a lot of different forest types. So we have white spruce, pine, deciduous, the mixed woods, and the black spruce being our major ones. The numbers across the bottom represent the age class. So 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, so on and so forth. You can also see the circular dots and the error bars arising with those. The circular dots represent those types of forest of those age classes that originate from harvest, versus the error bars on the actual bars themselves represent the response, the density of the bird as a function of age class forest type after, if it was originating from fire. So what this suggests with the data that we do have is, in fact, the bird is tending to be more likely to be found in, younger stands post-harvest than younger stands post-fire. However, its happiest place is 60-year-old deciduous forest, throughout particularly the eastern half of the province. But we do find them in mixed woods. We periodically find them in pine, white spruce as well. The wetlands are over to the right. And they're there, but they're not there in any distinct numbers. Now, a very important thing to remember, Alberta is an amazingly patchy place where you go from a wetland into a pine stand down into an aspen stand, all in the, in the space of 500 to 600 meters kind of thing. So there are probably spatial configuration components of this that just really aren't reflected by the model. One of the things to remember, about 70% of this landscape is what we would call black spruce, lowland, wetland types, swamps, that kind of stuff. And about 30% of it's what we would call upland. So the mixed woods, the deciduous, the white spruce. Of the deciduous, 60-year-old deciduous is the most common upland forest type in existence in the region. And it's basically, we had huge fires back in the 1910s to 20s. And we're just, that's the fire, the forest has regrown following that. So we predicted as a map, this is what it looks like. It's quite detailed. I mean, these are definitely counts where, we do not just get, presence of an individual, we get multiple individuals like everybody else has talked about, 2s and 3s are quite common. Now this is just to show you some variation in the pictures. So this is the location of the ARUs. You have to remember where the bird is relative to the ARU is sometimes, obviously, we don't know that exactly, but the top right is a classic 60-year-old aspen stand with a relatively, I would actually call that it's maybe dense-ish, but it's very short, right? It's not a very thick shrub cover, and you actually have reasonably closed canopy. The one on the bottom is a great example where, you're at the edge of an aspen stand in a larch wetland, and we also find them there. And then the one on the left here, this is actually just a very recent fire where we found the birds quite happily singing away. A little bit of an anecdote on, and this is just my personal experience and my discovery of a few nests in aspen stands, as they tend to be associated with Shepherdea canadensis, which is soap or buffalo berry, depending on what you like to do, how you like to call it. This is a plant that definitely tends to be found in flat places, I think, and it's not in a place that's super wet generally. So a little bit anecdotal on that part, but again, a lot of variation going into this.
Hey, Erin, how old was that stand in the top right picture, the aspen?
That's about 60.
That's 60?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So like everything in Alberta, especially our political climate, I say keep calm and remain cautiously optimistic, because the bird isn't, there's a big pocket of them that we have here. Unfortunately, when we look at some of our human impact models, like forestry, for example, as I just talked about, some of the responses to oil and gas footprint, they're not super strong. It's not that the bird is avoiding all of the development that's happening in Alberta. It's also not, liking it per se. But, I guess there is some reason for optimism. Now, given I have a couple more minutes, I'd also like to maybe just, put out some bigger Canada things that we also have that maybe add some complexity to the story. So this is just the map, and for those who are interested, this is the data that's available in Wild Tracks. So this is all of the point count data, and then the ARU data adds to this, and it looks very consistent. So I mean, there is quite a bit of information that we can use to build, models and things like that. And I'll show you some examples of how we use this. But one thing Kevin, Hannah, and I and a grad student worked on was to try and see maybe if there was, given the differences in habitat are so different between different parts of the country, maybe we're talking subspecies, maybe we're talking, something genetically unique, maybe we're talking something totally different. So what we did is we actually tried to put together a bunch of songs from across the country, and we looked for the various song types, and there's all kinds of variation in Connecticut Warbler song. I think there's 20 odd song types that we came up with. And through a lot of analysis and a pretty decent sample size, we did not find very distinct geographical structure in song type. It's highly variable. It seems to be clumped. We do see that, where there's clumps of the song type, but it's not like you can find song type H, for example, in Alberta, and you can find it in Michigan. And various other ones. So it's not a really distinct, I don't think we have like a really clear subspecies designation. We've got a lot of what looks like mobility. So this graph, this is what people have kind of mentioned this paper. This is a paper written by a postdoc in BAM called named MD Crosby. But what he looked at here was sort of like, if you took a habitat model from one region and you tried to use it to predict where you would find the birds in another region, how well would you do? And that's the graph on the left. And not surprisingly, if you take a look at all these species on the bottom, some models actually work really well. Like Canada Warbler, you can use region A and project to region B and do not bad in saying where they are. But if you actually take Connecticut Warbler, it is the worst, right? They change so fundamentally from east to west, and that is just a real phenomena that we just do not fully understand. And I think what's critically important to this thing is we have pine in Alberta. We have tamarack stands in Alberta. They're not in them. So there's something fundamentally different in terms of, that making that choice. It's not just an availability thing is what it comes down to. Now, the other thing, Mike's going to talk about this later, but there is this paper that tried to highlight, so it put together all of the geolocator data that existed. We were able to capture something like 30 Connecticut warblers in Alberta and put geolocators on them. And Mike used this information to try and understand sort of, given the trends that we have in these different populations across the country, what were the most likely drivers based on where their wintering grounds were. Now, I'm not going to belabor this too much. I'll let Mike do that. But basically, one of the conclusions was, even though the decline in Alberta is lower than elsewhere, there's a correlation between the amount of habitat loss in the breeding grounds and that pattern, as well as it was one of the only populations where it was going on the wintering grounds could explain also part of the population decline. So there's a lot more information in here that we could use to try and pull some of this apart. But Mike's, probably the right person to talk to about that. So with that, I think I whipped through that, and that's about where we're at.
Great. Thanks, Erin. Quick question. Oh, okay. Yeah, that was fantastic. And a much rosier picture. We probably should have had you go first or last or something. But maybe Mark's got a similar story. British Columbia, we're going to hear from Mark next.
Yeah, let's see if I can share this screen. Do you see a bird yet?
We do.
All right, let me go to presentation mode. Alrighty, so basically a lot similar to what Erin said, actually. Our birds are in, well, we'll get to that in a second. We'll cover the same topics here. This guy is pretty typical of how birders who come to this part of BC to find Connecticut warblers, this is what they end up seeing if they're lucky. Bird in the singing male sitting in the basically the bottom of an aspen canopy, pretty well glued to a perch, singing nonstop and giving the occasional glance downward at these crazy people that are staring back up at it. In BC, the Connecticut warbler is restricted to the area east of the Rocky Mountains. So the height of the Rockies is drawn approximately in that yellow line there. The government had a sort of a model distribution of potential habitat done quite a few years ago based on climate, for the most part, elevation. Turned out to be relatively accurate, I think. On the right there is the results from our one and only breeding bird atlas, which concluded, I think it was 2012. So there's two basically separate populations, or separated anyway. That big white expanse in between the northern and the southern parts is basically sort of high elevation, poor site conifer. So pretty well all of our birds are, as I say, in the boreal taiga plains, BCR6, and east of the height of the Rockies. And this is pretty much where we find them. Like Erin said, sort of middle-aged aspen. And for us, it's even, I've noticed a progression from the east to the west in terms of when they, they kind of start to use aspen in maybe in southern Ontario, more so in Manitoba, and the further west you go, the more often sort of upland aspen is mentioned. And by the time we talk about northeastern BC, it's almost exclusive. Now, pure is in sort of quotes here because our forest cover mapping considers pure anything sort of 80% or beyond. So there definitely are places where you'll find Connecticut warbler that have some pine, white spruce, black spruce, but the predominant tree is going to be aspen, and almost all of our birds are found in cover like this. Warm mesic sites. If it gets too wet, you get too much balsam poplar, too much tall shrubbery. They don't like it too dry, and you don't get that lush vegetation on the ground. Typically closed canopy, not that they really need that, but if the canopy is too open, then that changes the ground layer. Open understory, like we've seen in many of those pictures from, especially from the northern states, you switch this out for jack pine and change the vegetation on the ground a bit, and boy, structurally it looks very similar. They do seem to be very selective about the ground cover. Coarse weedy debris, there's not a lot of it, typically quite sparse. Consistently lush herbaceous layer like grass, pea vine, low to moderate amount of sort of low shrubby, rose, supalalia, that's the soapberry that Erin was talking about, Saskatoon, but it clearly avoids, once you start getting taller shrubs, tall willows, alders, even aspen suckers, does not like to be in those areas. It wants a place that, if it looks like a good place to stop and have a picnic, you're likely to have a Connecticut warbler singing there. really though, one of the problems with this whole thing is in BC anyway. Now, I think we could probably learn from some others, but our attempts at modeling Connecticut warbler habitat have been a miserable failure, and that's mostly because of, I think, the VRI, which is Vegetation Resource Inventory, does a very poor job of describing that ground layer and low shrub layer. It focuses mostly on the canopy and subcanopy. So the models that were generated by the government a few years ago, basically no better than random. So kind of a failure on that one. There's a history to this. In the very early days, when people realized that we had Connecticut warblers here, and the thought was they were rare, people did literature reviews, and they looked back and they said, oh, look, yeah, Connecticut warblers are a bird of pine barrens and spruce bogs, and God, we got a lot of that, so they shouldn't be in any trouble. Well, obviously that's, as we've seen with this bird, different habitat requirements in different areas. So then there was a realization that they were actually sort of a deciduous bird, an upland aspen or aspen cottonwood balsam poplar type thing. But that resulted in a huge overestimate of likely distribution, because not all of these stands are of equal desirability or suitability by the birds. They're very, very specific in terms of their ground cover requirements. For us, I'm happy to hear what Erin said about regenerating harvested areas, but for all the work I've done here, all of the blocks or all of the areas where we found them have been in natural fire origin stands. Some of the best habitat I've seen comes from where we get low intensity spring burns, whether those were natural or started by sort of range enhancement programs, doesn't matter. The result was the same. Sometimes we get 2-age stands that come out of that, and those are also pretty good for Connecticut warblers. But I really don't know about how regenerating harvested stands are going to stand up in terms of providing what the bird needs, because there is a difference, obviously, between harvesting and fire. And the tendency is, especially on crown land, for timber harvesting to occur in conditions that have minimum impacts to the soils and the shrub layer. So typically they're tiptoeing in on deep snowpack or frozen ground conditions, harvesting the canopy, the mature trees, and then getting out. And so what's left afterwards is certainly a different type of soil and ground shrub layer than would occur after a fire. And the jury is still out over here. The earliest deciduous harvested blocks are just now coming into the right age where they would likely be providing Connecticut warbler habitat. So I hope to get out and have a look at some of those, but I just don't know yet if it'll be the same result as a fire. There's a 2-age stand that I was talking about. You can see some of those big old vets that are well over 100 years old, and then the rest of the stand is probably half that. I did some territory mapping on a project over 10 years on this plot of land. You can see here, it is laid out approximately the same. So I'm looking in the same direction here, looking north on here is sort of north up here. The number of territories ranged from, this area was about 42 hectares, I think. And I had anywhere between 1 and 9 territories of Connecticut warbler in there over a 10-year span. I don't know, there's a lot of variation, and later on I can talk about some of the issues that probably contributed to those differences. But you can sort of see the canopy is fairly dense here. The status in BC, it was a red listed bird, considered S2, but mostly from the results of the Breeding Bird Atlas, it was upgraded basically, or less concerned. It's been changed to blue list and S3 now. There is no, but that means nothing in BC, frankly. It's there's no Endangered Species Act, so there's no extra protection afforded for that ranking. You know, the same as everywhere else. I think in Canada, the birds and their nests are protected by the Wildlife Acts or the federal act. What is different is in BC, the Connecticut Warbler is listed as a species at risk under the BC Forest and Range Practices Act. So those are species which are thought that they could be unduly impacted by forest or range practices. So what that does is allow certain areas to be designated as wildlife habitat areas for the specific protection for those species. And in the case of Connecticut Warbler, there have been 10 of these wildlife habitat areas created mostly in the southern part of the bird's range in the Peace Country of BC, ranging from 26 to just over 100 hectares. 6 of those 10 still had territorial birds 15 years later when the government did some monitoring. Some of the conservation issues, cattle grazing is very widespread on, and most of what we're talking about here is crown land or public land. Cattle grazing, the ranchers have licenses to set their cows out and graze on public land. From what I've seen, low-level grazing is probably compatible with suitable habitat. I've seen cows and Connecticut warblers in the same areas, but sadly, that is more an exception rather than the rule. Overgrazing is very common, and it really renders the habitat unsuitable because it's just mowed right down to nothing. There's essentially no herbaceous layer left. For how long, I don't know. You'd probably have to exclude the cattle for a while and see how quickly it comes back. It may be relatively short, but it needs to have that opportunity, and it seems like that opportunity is not forthcoming. There's a lot of overgrazing going on. Another issue, of course, is the presence of cattle does attract brown-headed cowbirds well into deep into the forest, not just along the agricultural edges of fields and whatnot. We really don't know how much of an issue cowbird parasitism is, but it certainly does occur. I've only found a couple of Connecticut Warbler nests. There was one right smack in the middle of this picture here. Started off with 5 Connecticut Warbler eggs, and the parents managed to raise 3 big, fat, healthy cowbird chicks. The bigger issue likely is forestry. Northeastern BC, where the Connecticut Warbler is the only place in BC that has a thriving deciduous forest products industry. There's a siding mill, OSB, and an upcoming pellet mill. So just to give you an idea of what's out there from sort of south to north here, within the timber supply areas, this doesn't include private land. I would say both the Dawson Creek and Fort St. John areas, the deciduous cut is probably more than that because the companies take a lot of deciduous timber from private land as well. Just saying that there is pressure to harvest a lot of that potential Connecticut Warbler habitat. Sadly, amongst forest companies, there's really zero management focus. The main thing I've seen so far is pretty well all the companies have some procedure to reduce timber harvesting during nesting season, which is more of a migratory bird federal act issue, but there's really nothing in terms of long-term habitat modeling. Yeah, and there's no sort of BC version of a habitat model that's effective and that people are using at this point. And there is the uncertainty of post-harvest suitability. So realistically, I would say that the amount of suitable habitat for this bird is almost certainly declining. We have a couple other
That
side
last
issues.
slide, Mark.
Very close. Couple other quick issues. You can see oil and gas imprint here on the right. There's a lot of impact from them. Monitoring, not likely to. There's no monitoring. We'll find out some truth, I think, in the next bird atlas. I expect there to be a big surprise, just like we've heard further east. LiDAR modeling could help. It's not widely available. We need more focus from the forest industry and awareness, and maybe create some more wildlife habitat areas in the meantime. So generally pessimistic. Breeding populations seem to have declined, just like we saw in some of those earlier graphs in recent years. And I believe that is it.
All right, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Fantastic coverage across Canada. Really appreciate those updates. Everybody maybe stretch a little bit, take a deep breath, get a drink. we got one more little bit here. We're in the kind of the 8th inning, maybe for the morning session anyway. And next up, we're going to turn way down south.
Brian, I'm going to stop recording here and then restart a new round for file size. So if you want to just pause for a quick second while I stop and restart, that'd be great.